Power does not always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it settles quietly into everyday life, becoming so familiar that it no longer looks like abuse at all. In the antebellum South, men like the Colonel lived inside a world designed to protect them from consequence. Rank, land, whiteness, and wealth formed a shield so complete that almost nothing done within its boundaries could be questioned. Law, religion, and custom bent themselves around this power, reinforcing the belief that authority was not merely held, but deserved. Within such a world, the unimaginable did not appear monstrous. It appeared possible. The Colonel was not an outcast or a madman lurking at the edges of society. He was respected, addressed with titles, welcomed in polite rooms. His name carried weight. His opinions were listened to. His presence reassured others that order was being maintained. This is what makes the story so unsettling. The foundation for what followed was not chaos, but structure. Not secrecy, but permission. Slavery did not exist alongside morality. It replaced it with something colder and far more flexible. Absolute power reshapes the mind of the person who holds it. Over time, restraint begins to feel unnecessary, even foolish. When no one can say no, desire slowly transforms into entitlement. The Colonel lived in a system where human beings could be owned, bought, disciplined, and erased without explanation. Once that boundary was crossed, once people became property, every other boundary weakened. If a man could own bodies, why could he not also rearrange lives? Why could he not redefine marriage, family, or decency according to his will? In such households, there were no true witnesses. Plantations were private worlds, governed internally, shielded from scrutiny by distance and custom. What happened behind their walls rarely reached public judgment, and when it did, it was filtered through the voices of men who benefited from the same silence. Servants, enslaved people, wives, and children all lived under the understanding that speaking openly carried risk. Silence became the language of survival. The Colonel understood this. His authority did not rely on force alone, but on the certainty that nothing he did would truly be challenged. Even if rumors escaped, they would be softened, redirected, or dismissed. Respectability acted as armor. A man of his standing could always be given the benefit of doubt. The system did not just excuse him, it anticipated his needs. This is how power becomes dangerous without appearing violent. It creates an environment where moral limits erode gradually, replaced by rationalization. What begins as control over land and labor extends into control over relationships, bodies, futures. The Colonel did not wake one morning having crossed every line at once. He moved through a world that quietly removed those lines for him. Women in this world were not free actors, even at the highest levels of society. Marriage was often less a partnership than a transfer of authority from father to husband. A wife's role was to preserve reputation, produce heirs, and remain silent about discomfort. Her body, like the bodies of the enslaved, was governed by expectation rather than consent. The difference was one of language, not of reality. Both were constrained by a system that privileged male control. Within this moral vacuum, the Colonel's household functioned according to his will. He was judge, lawgiver, and final authority. Those beneath him learned quickly that obedience was safer than resistance, silence safer than truth. Over time, this dynamic created an atmosphere where the unthinkable could be considered without shock, where cruelty could be framed as necessity or strategy. The Colonel did not need to announce his dominance loudly. It was already understood. Every interaction reinforced it. Every meal served. Every command followed. Every person who deferred to him strengthened the illusion that his choices were beyond question. This is how a dynasty convinces itself of its own righteousness, even as it rots from within. What makes this first keynote essential is understanding that the agreement which later destroyed everything did not emerge from madness or desperation. It emerged logically from a system that had already stripped humanity from those it controlled. The agreement was not a break from the Colonel's world. It was a continuation of it. When power goes unchecked, it does not remain satisfied with what it has. It seeks new expressions, new confirmations of dominance. Slavery taught men like the Colonel that other people existed for their use. Once that belief takes root, it does not stop at the boundaries of race or law. It spreads inward, consuming family, intimacy, and identity. The dynasty appeared strong from the outside. Land expanded, wealth accumulated, respect was performed publicly. But inside, the moral foundation had already collapsed. The Colonel's authority depended on the silence of others and the absence of accountability. Such power is inherently unstable. It demands constant reinforcement, constant proof that control remains absolute. This is the world in which the agreement became possible. Not a moment of insanity, but a product of long conditioning. A society that normalized ownership of people could not suddenly draw clear ethical lines when ownership crossed into other realms. The Colonel's decision, however shocking it appears now, was enabled by a culture that trained him to believe that everything within his reach was subject to his will. Power without limits does not just corrupt actions, it corrupts imagination. It convinces those who hold it that there are no consequences worth fearing, no boundaries worth respecting. In such a world, destruction does not arrive suddenly. It grows quietly, nurtured by silence, until the very structures meant to preserve legacy become the instruments of its collapse. This keynote does not excuse what followed. It explains how it could happen. It exposes the environment that allowed one man's authority to expand until it consumed everything around him. The agreement that would later destroy the dynasty did not fall from the sky. It was born in a world that had already decided whose lives mattered, whose voices counted, and whose suffering could be ignored. And when power is built on that kind of denial, its downfall is never a surprise. It is only delayed. From the outside, the colonel's marriage appeared stable, even admirable, the kind of union praised in polite society as proper and enduring. But beneath that appearance lay a reality shaped, not by affection or equality, but by control. In the world they inhabited, marriage was less a bond between two people than a structure designed to preserve lineage, property, and reputation. Love, if it existed at all, was secondary. What mattered was order, obedience, and silence. The wife entered this marriage already constrained, her role defined long before she could shape it for herself. She was raised to understand her value in terms of what she represented rather than who she was. As a young woman of status, her body carried expectations that were never spoken plainly but always enforced. She was meant to produce heirs, maintain the household's dignity, and absorb discomfort without complaint. Her education prepared her to endure, not to question. Marriage transferred authority over her life from one man to another, and the law supported that transfer fully. Once married, her legal identity merged into her husband's. Her will was not erased outright, but it was rendered irrelevant. Within the household, this imbalance defined every interaction. Decisions were made without her participation. Publicly, she was displayed as evidence of refinement and stability. Privately, she existed within narrow boundaries, expected to perform loyalty and composure regardless of circumstance. The colonel's authority over her was total, though rarely described in such terms. It was softened by language, duty, protection, provision, but its effect was unmistakable. She did not belong to herself. This dynamic matters because it reveals how the later agreement did not violate the marriage as it existed. It followed its logic. The marriage was already built on ownership. Consent was assumed rather than granted. Her body was treated as an extension of the household's assets, valuable for what it could produce and symbolize. In such a context, the idea that she could meaningfully refuse was a fiction. Silence became her primary survival tool. Speaking openly about discomfort or fear would have threatened not only her standing, but the entire image the household depended on. Women who challenged their husbands risked social isolation, institutional punishment, or worse. Reputation was a weapon wielded against them, capable of destroying what little security they had. Remaining silent was not weakness, it was calculation. The colonel's power over her was reinforced daily by the structure of the world around them. Clergy preached obedience. Law affirmed male authority. Community expectations rewarded women who endured quietly. Even sympathy, when offered, came with conditions. She was expected to bear her role with grace, to internalize suffering as virtue. In this way, the system trained women to police themselves, reducing the need for overt force. Over time, the distance between husband and wife widened. Not through conflict, but through inevitability. She learned to occupy a narrow emotional space, careful not to provoke displeasure or suspicion. Intimacy became procedural, stripped of mutuality. Her body served functions determined by others, while her inner life remained unacknowledged. The marriage did not collapse, it hardened. This erosion of agency is essential to understanding what followed. When the colonel later treated her as something that could be exchanged or reassigned, he was not inventing a new role for her. He was extending one that already existed. The system had prepared both of them for this outcome, teaching him to command and her to endure. What makes this keynote especially unsettling is how ordinary it was. Nothing about this marriage would have raised alarm in its time. It followed accepted patterns, reinforced by institutions that claimed moral authority. The violence embedded within it was normalized, disguised as order and tradition. This normalization allowed far greater violations to occur without resistance. Her voice was not absent because she lacked thoughts or feelings. It was absent because the system had no place for it. Even if she had spoken, there was no mechanism to protect her. The law would not have intervened. The community would not have defended her. Silence was the only option that preserved any semblance of stability. In this marriage, consent became irrelevant long before the agreement that would later define the story. The groundwork was laid through years of quiet submission demanded and enforced. By the time the unthinkable was proposed, resistance had already been eroded. The question was no longer whether she agreed, but whether agreement mattered at all. This keynote reveals a truth often overlooked. The destruction of the dynasty did not begin with scandal. It began with a marriage that treated one partner as property and the other as sovereign. The agreement that followed merely exposed what had always been there, stripping away the polite language that had hidden it. By understanding the marriage is a structure of ownership rather than partnership, the later collapse becomes inevitable rather than shocking. A dynasty built on control cannot survive once that control turns inward. The same logic that justified domination over enslaved people eventually consumed the household itself. This was not a failure of love. It was a failure of humanity embedded in a system that taught people to confuse power with legitimacy. And once that confusion takes hold, no relationship, no matter how revered, remains untouched by its consequences. The agreement did not arrive with raised voices or written contracts. It emerged quietly, shaped by implication rather than declaration, formed in a space where power did not need to explain itself. In households like the colonial's, decisions of consequence were often made in silence, behind doors that closed gently, leaving no trace for outsiders to find. What would later be described in whispers as an arrangement began at a conclusion already reached, a decision framed as inevitability rather than choice. There was no gathering where all parties spoke freely. There was no moment where consent was sought in any meaningful sense. The wife was not invited into a discussion about her own body. The enslaved men were not consulted as human beings. The agreement functioned precisely because it did not recognize the need for permission. It relied on the existing hierarchy, on the understanding that authority flowed in one direction only. The colonel's voice carried weight not because it was persuasive, but because it was final. His power did not depend on logic or morality. It depended on the certainty that his word would be obeyed. In a world structured around domination, explanation was unnecessary. Orders were softened into suggestions. Decisions framed as arrangements. Coercion is guised as management. What makes this moment especially disturbing is its calmness. There was no sense of transgression within the household's logic. The colonel believed himself to be acting within his rights, exercising control over assets he already owned. His wife's body, the enslaved men's bodies, the household's future, all were treated as variables to be managed. The agreement was not seen as a moral breach, but as a solution. For the wife, resistance was rendered invisible, even if she objected internally. There was no language available to express refusal without consequence. The system had long taught her that endurance was expected, that discomfort was private, that obedience was safety. The agreement did not ask her to surrender something new. It demanded what had always been assumed. For the enslaved men, the situation was even more brutal. They were placed in an impossible position, trapped between fear and survival. Participation was not desire. It was coercion under threat. Refusal carried consequences that did not need to be spelled out. Violence was always present, even when it remained unspoken. The absence of overt force did not make the act voluntary. It made it more insidious. Silence became the defining feature of the agreement. It protected the colonel from scrutiny. It shielded the household's reputation. It erased accountability. Each participant understood that speaking openly would invite punishment or ruin. Silence was not complicity, it was servive. All enforced by power, the agreement's true violence lay not only in what it demanded, but in how it normalized that demand. By framing it as an arrangement rather than an assault, the colonel transformed cruelty into administration. The language of control replaced the language of harm. This is how systems of domination maintain themselves, by redefining abuse as order. There were no witnesses because the structure itself erased the need for them. Enslaved people could not testify. Wives could not accuse. Communities preferred not to know. Even if fragments of truth escaped, they were absorbed into rumor and dismissed as exaggeration. The agreement existed in a space protected by disbelief. The colonel understood this protection intuitively. His confidence did not come from recklessness, but from experience. He had watched other transgressions go unpunished, other abuses reframed or ignored. He knew where the boundaries truly lay, and he knew they would not restrain him. The enslaved men were forced to carry not only fear, but confusion. The agreement violated boundaries even slavery had taught them to recognize. They were denied the dignity of refusal and the comfort of clarity. They were made instruments of a decision that would later be used to condemn them, even though they had no power to shape it. This is one of slavery's deepest cruelties, forcing people into actions that destroy them morally while denying them agency. The wife's isolation deepened. Whatever private thoughts she held could not be shared. To speak would have shattered the fragile structure protecting her from complete erasure. She became a participant without power, a figure acted upon rather than acting. Her silence was not acceptance. It was containment. This keynote exposes how the agreement relied on a shared understanding that some lives did not require consent. It was an extension of the same logic that allowed people to be owned, sold, and used. Once that logic is accepted, nothing remains sacred. Bodies become resources. Relationships become strategies. The agreement did not need to be written because it was already inscribed into the system. Law, custom, and violence upheld it without documentation. What was truly agreed upon was not the act itself, but the continued belief that power justified everything. Later generations would struggle to understand how such a thing could happen. They would search for madness or scandal, something exceptional to explain it. But the truth is far more unsettling. Nothing about the agreement required a break from the colonel's world. It required only the absence of restraint, an absence carefully maintained by slavery and patriarchy alike. This is the moment where the dynasty crossed a line it could not uncross, not because the act itself was new, but because it revealed too clearly what had always been true. The agreement stripped away the last illusions of honor and respectability. It exposed a household governed entirely by domination, incapable of recognizing humanity even within its own walls. From this silence, everything else followed. The agreement did not merely damage the family, it hollowed it out. It replaced trust with fear, legitimacy with secrecy. What had once been hidden beneath tradition now stood naked, even if no one dared to name it. In the end, the agreement was not a pact between people. It was a declaration of ownership taken to its most extreme conclusion. And once such a declaration is made, there is no returning to the illusion of order. The collapse that followed was not sudden. It was inevitable. For the enslaved men, the agreement was not an event but a trap that closed without warning. It placed them in a space where every path led to harm, where survival itself became a source of shame and fear. They were not actors with choices, they were bodies caught in a decision made far above them, a decision enforced by a system that punished refusal and weaponized silence. What the household later whispered about as arrangement or necessity was, for them, a constant negotiation with terror. They understood the rules of the world they lived in. Obedience preserved life. Resistance invited pain, separation, or death. Yet this situation demanded something that cut against even the brutal logic of enslavement as they had known it. It forced them into a moral violence that did not end with physical exhaustion. It followed them into memory, into sleep, into the way they understood themselves. Slavery had already taken their labor and their freedom. Now it demanded their participation in a secret that would stain them regardless of what they did. Fear shaped every moment. Fear of punishment if they refused. Fear of being blamed for something they did not initiate. Fear of being destroyed quietly, without witnesses, if they spoke. The power imbalance was absolute. The colonel's authority did not need to be reinforced with threats. It was embedded in the structure of daily life. Everyone knew what defiance cost. The men learned quickly that silence was not just expected, it was necessary. They were denied even the dignity of being seen as victims. The system that enslaved them also ensured that any harm done to them would be reframed as misconduct on their part. This inversion of blame was one of slavery's most effective tools. It allowed those in power to commit acts of profound violence while preserving their own innocence. The enslaved men carried the risk of condemnation for actions they could not refuse. Isolation deepened the cruelty. They could not speak to one another freely, could not seek counsel, could not share the weight of what was happening without risking exposure. Trust itself became dangerous. The household thrived on separation, ensuring that fear remained individualized and unspoken. What could not be named could not be challenged. The psychological toll was immense. Survival required compartmentalization, learning to separate the self from the body, memory from action. This was not resilience in any heroic sense, it was damage management. Each man learned to endure by dulling parts of himself, by narrowing his emotional range until pain could be survived. This narrowing left scars that did not heal easily. They were also trapped in anticipation of consequences they could not predict. At any moment, the agreement could be used against them, turned into justification for punishment or sale. What was demanded in private could be condemned in public. This uncertainty was deliberate. It kept them compliant, always aware that their safety depended on silence and obedience. The agreement distorted their relationships with one another. Shared suffering did not always produce solidarity. Fear disrupted trust. Each man knew that another's word could mean his ruin. The system cultivated this fracture intentionally, preventing collective resistance by turning survival into an individual burden. There was no space for moral clarity. Every option available to them carried harm. Refusal risked immediate violence. Compliance risked lifelong guilt and future punishment. This is what it meant to be trapped between fear and survival, to be forced into choices that were not choices at all, then judged as if they were. What history often fails to record is how such coercion lingers. Long after the immediate danger passed, the damage remained. The men carried a sense of contamination imposed upon them by power, a feeling that something had been taken that could not be restored. This was not because of any inherent wrongdoing on their part, but because the system required them to internalize blame. Their humanity was denied in two directions at once. They were treated as tools to be used, then as moral failures for having been used. This double bind was not accidental. It protected those at the top by transferring shame downward. The enslaved men became convenient repositories for the household's corruption. In late retellings, if the story surfaced at all, their experiences were flattened or distorted. They were rarely described as coerced, rarely granted complexity. Silence followed them even beyond the moment, cemented by a culture that refused to see enslaved people as capable of victimhood. This keynote insists on their perspective not to sensationalize suffering but to restore truth. What they endured was not participation, it was entrapment, not consent, coercion, not agency, survival under threat. Any account that ignores this reality repeats the violence by misnaming it. The agreement did not merely damage the colonel's household, inflicted lasting harm on the men forced into its orbit. Their lives continued under the shadow of something they did not choose and could not escape. They learned, with devastating clarity, that in a world built on domination, even survival could be turned against you. To understand the collapse that followed, one must understand this pressure, this impossible posse. Tie-in imposed on the enslaved men. The dynasty's destruction was seated here, in the mortal violence inflicted on those with the least power, whose suffering was essential to maintaining the illusion of control. When a system forces people to survive by denying their own humanity, it guarantees that nothing built upon it can endure. What finally began to fracture the dynasty was not outrage from the outside but decay from within. The agreement had been designed to assert control, to manage the future, as if bloodlines and inheritance could be engineered like property. Instead, it introduced a slow, corrosive uncertainty that seeped into every corner of the household. Questions that could not be spoken openly began to shape decisions quietly, altering relationships and eroding trust. The very thing elite families prized above all else, certainty of lineage, had been destabilized by the colonel's own hand. In a society obsessed with blood, inheritance was more than wealth. It was legitimacy. Names, land, and power were meant to pass cleanly from father to son, reinforcing the illusion of order and continuity. The agreement shattered that illusion. Even if no one dared to speak plainly, doubt entered the household like a contaminant. Who belonged? Who did not? Which child carried the colonel's name in truth, and which carried only the appearance of it? These questions had no safe answers, yet they could not be unasked. Silence did not erase suspicion. It sharpened it. Family members began to watch one another more closely, reading meaning into gestures and appearances. Affection became guarded. Favoritism took on new significance. Every decision about education, inheritance, or marriage felt charged with hidden meaning. The household's public face remained composed, but internally it was unraveling. The colonel, authority, once unquestioned, began to strain under the weight of what he had created. To preserve order, he had to control not only people, but narratives. He could not allow doubt to become public, because public doubt would invite scandal, and scandal would destroy everything he had built. The solution was secrecy layered upon secrecy, a constant effort to manage perception rather than reality. This effort demanded vigilance. Records were altered or left vague. Conversations were redirected. Decisions were justified with explanations that raised more questions than they answered. The more control the colonel exerted, the more obvious the strain became. Power that must constantly defend itself is already weakening. Inheritance, once a straightforward mechanism of continuity, became a source of anxiety. Wealth was still present, land still held, but legitimacy had become fragile. Heirs existed, but certainty did not. The dynasty's future, once imagined as secure and inevitable, now depended on silence holding firm across generations. This was an impossible demand. The wife, already erased as an agent, became a living symbol of this instability. Her presence reminded the household of what could not be acknowledged. She embodied the contradiction at the heart of the family, the desire to maintain respectability while having violated its foundation. Her continued silence was necessary, but it could not restore what had been lost. The enslaved people remained at the center of this contradiction, though they were pushed further into invisibility. Their existence made the questions unavoidable, yet their voices were excluded entirely. The dynasty relied on their silence while also fearing what that silence concealed. This tension poisoned the household, creating an atmosphere of unease that no amount of authority could dispel. As years passed, the cracks widened. Heirs grew older. Decisions about succession became unavoidable. Each choice risked exposing the truth, or at least acknowledging doubt. Even when the colonel acted decisively, his actions carried the weight of what he was trying to suppress. Control no longer looked confident. It looked desperate. The wider community sensed something, even if it did not know what. Rumors circulated, incomplete and contradictory. Respectability began to fray at the edges. The dynasty's name still commanded attention, but it no longer inspired unquestioned admiration. Power, once effortless, required explanation. Explanation invited scrutiny. What destroyed the dynasty was not a single revelation, but the accumulation of unresolved contradictions. A family cannot survive on silence. See alone. A legacy cannot be built on denial without eventually collapsing under its own weight. The colonel's attempt to manage bloodlines as property undermined the very principle that made inheritance meaningful. Children raised within this environment absorbed its instability. They learned to perform certainty while living with doubt. This inheritance of uncertainty proved more damaging than any loss of wealth. It fractured identity, eroded loyalty, and turned legacy into a burden rather than a gift. The dynasty's collapse did not arrive with dramatic exposure or public trial. It arrived quietly, through weakened alliances, disputed claims, and a gradual loss of cohesion. Land was sold. Influence diminished. The name faded from prominence. Outsiders might have attributed this decline to mismanagement or changing times. Few would have traced it back to the agreement that set everything in motion, yet the connection was direct. By violating the moral foundations it depended on, the dynasty had compromised its own future. Power used without restraint does not preserve itself. It destabilizes everything it touches. This keynote reveals the deep irony at the heart of the story. The colonel sought to control lineage absolutely, to secure his dynasty beyond question. Instead, he introduced uncertainty that no amount of authority could resolve. The very obsession with inheritance became the instrument of its destruction. What remained in the end was not triumph or continuity, but fragmentation. A family name stripped of its former meaning. A legacy remembered only in fragments and rumors. The dynasty did not fall because it was challenged from below. It fell because it consumed itself. This is how systems built on domination often end, not with justice delivered in full view, but with quiet disintegration. The agreement did not just harm those it directly violated. It poisoned the future the colonel was trying to protect. And in doing so, it ensured that the dynasty he sought to preserve could not survive its own secret. What allowed the agreement to endure as long as it did was not ignorance, but a collective decision not to see. The community around the colonel's household was not blind, it was selective. In towns and plantations like this, knowledge moved quietly, passed through glance, unfinished sentences, and rumors that never hardened into accusation. People sensed when something was wrong, but sensing did not require action. Silence was safer, and safety mattered more than truth. Neighbors noticed changes long before they admitted them to themselves. There were shifts in behavior, patterns that did not align with the public story. Whispers followed servants who were suddenly reassigned. Glances lingered a little too long, but these observations floated without anchor, unspoken in any space where they might demand response. To speak openly would have been to challenge not just one man, but the entire structure that protected him, the colonel. Status insulated him. Rank did not merely command respect, it discouraged scrutiny. To question him was to question the order that placed others below him and above the enslaved. Clergy, officials, and fellow landowners shared an interest in maintaining that order. They understood that exposing one man's abuses might open doors they did not want opened. Silence became a form of mutual protection. Moral authority in this world was deeply compromised. Religious leaders preached obedience and propriety, but their sermons stopped short of confronting power directly. They spoke in generalities, careful not to name specific wrongs that would require specific action. Faith, like law, was flexible when applied to those with status. This flexibility allowed cruelty to hide behind respectability. Women in the community often sensed the truth most clearly, but they were bound by the same constraints that silenced the colonel's wife. To acknowledge what was happening openly would have been to invite scandal that would harm not just one household but many. Reputation was a fragile currency. Protecting it meant sacrificing honesty. Compassion was constrained by fear. Even among those who felt unease, there was a tendency to rationalize. Perhaps the rumors were exaggerated. Perhaps there was a reasonable explanation. Perhaps it was not their place to intervene. Each rationalization pushed responsibility further away, until no one felt obligated to act. This diffusion of responsibility was not accidental. It was cultivated by a society that rewarded conformity. The enslaved people within the community knew the truth in ways others refused to. They lived with the consequences directly. Yet their knowledge carried no authority. Their testimonies, if offered, would have been dismissed or punished. The system ensured that the most accurate witnesses were also the least believed. This imbalance was essential to maintaining silence. What is most unsettling is how ordinary this complicity was. There were no mass conspiracies, no dramatic cover-ups, just daily decisions to look away, to change the subject, to prioritize comfort over conscience. This is how deeply rooted injustice survives, not through constant violence, but through routine indifference. As time passed, the silence itself became a shared secret. People learned which questions not to ask, which names not to mention. The community developed a collective amnesia, remembering only what was safe. This selective memory allowed life to continue without disruption, even as harm persisted beneath the surface. The cost of this silence was profound. It allowed the colonel's power to operate unchecked. It trapped the enslaved men in a situation with no avenue for relief. It isolated the wife completely. It ensured that when consequences finally arrived, they would be diffuse and destructive rather than corrective. Silence did not prevent damage. It delayed accountability until it was too late to contain. By refuse, to confront the truth early, the community guaranteed that the eventual collapse would be more severe. In protecting the appearance of order, they sacrificed its substance. This keynote exposes a truth often avoided in historical narratives. Injustice rarely survives alone. It is sustained by ordinary people choosing comfort over courage. The colonel's actions were extreme, but they were enabled by a culture that valued hierarchy more than humanity. When the dynasty began to crumble, when rulers hardened into consequences, many would claim surprise. But surprise was another form of denial. The signs had been there. The choice not to act had been made repeatedly, quietly, and collectively. The community's silence did not merely allow the agreement to happen. It legitimized it by refusing to name it as wrong. In doing so, it became complicit in the destruction that followed. This is the burden of looking away. Eventually the cost reaches everyone. In the end, the silence that protected the colonel did not protect the community. It corroded trust, hollowed moral authority, and left behind a legacy of unresolved harm. What was buried was not just a secret, but a chance to intervene before damage became destiny. This is the uncomfortable truth. This keynote demands we face. Power endures not only because of those who wield it, but because of those who choose not to challenge it. And when silence becomes a habit, injustice no longer needs to hide. What ultimately survived this is Tory was not the colonel's name, nor the estate, nor even the scandal itself, but the distortion of memory that followed. When the dynasty collapsed, people did not preserve the truth. They reshaped it. The most disturbing parts were sanded down, reframed, or quietly erased. What remained was a safer narrative, one that blamed circumstance, madness, or fate, rather than deliberate choices made by powerful people and tolerated by many more. Official records became careful documents. Court papers spoke in abstractions. Letters avoided specifics. Family genealogies skipped years entirely, as if time itself had nothing to say. The agreement that once controlled lives was never written plainly again. It existed only in fragments, hinted at through contradictions and silences. History, in this form, did not lie outright, it simply declined to remember. The colonel's descendants were among the first to reshape the story. They emphasized his service, his land, his influence. If his fall was mentioned, it was attributed to financial miscalculation or political enemies. The wife's suffering was reduced to a footnote, if acknowledged at all. The enslaved men vanished entirely from the narrative, absorbed in the anonymous mass that history often assigns to the powerless. This erasure was intentional, a way to salvage dignity from disgrace. Communities, too, participated in this rewriting. Stories told to children softened over time. Details were omitted for propriety. What could not be denied was reframed as rumor. What could not be explained was labeled complicated. By the next generation, the truth had become something impolite to question. By the generation after that, it was barely known. This process of forgetting was not passive. It required effort. Documents were hidden. Heirlooms were destroyed. Certain rooms were repurposed, their former uses never mentioned. Even language shifted, adopting euphemisms that concealed more than they revealed. Memory was curated to protect the living from the discomfort of the dead. The enslaved men left no records that survived. Their voices were the first casualties of this historical cleansing. Whenever they felt rage, confusion, despair, or quiet resistance was not preserved. Their humanity was stripped away a second time, not through bondage, but through oblivion. The bridges they built, the labor they provided, the suffering they endured all became invisible contribution to a society eager to enjoy results without acknowledging cost. The wife's memory suffered a different fate. She was remembered, when remembered at all, as tragic but vague. Her pain was abstracted into general sorrow detached from its causes. This allowed sympathy without accountability, mourning without reckoning. She became a symbol rather than a person, and symbols do not accuse. As decades passed, the absence of truth hardened into accepted history. Scholars who later encountered the fragments faced resistance when they tried to piece them together. Local archives were unhelpful. Family custodians discouraged inquiry. He passed, they insisted, should be left alone. This insistence was framed as respect, but it functioned as defense. What was lost in this erasure was not merely accuracy, but moral clarity, without confronting what actually happened. Later generations were denied the chance to understand how power operates when unchecked, how silence compounds harm, and how ordinary people become participants through inaction. Forgetting became a second injustice layered atop the first, yet traces persisted. In inconsistencies that refused to align, in buildings that felt wrong in ways architecture could not explain, in letters that stopped abruptly, in census records that listed bodies without stories. For those willing to look closely, the past still whispered. It did not shout, it murmured, asking to be acknowledged. This keynote rests on that whisper, on the idea that buried stories do not disappear, they wait. They wait in the margins of history, in the discomfort we feel when something does not add up. They wait for someone to choose truth over comfort, memory over convenience. To recover such a story is not to sensationalize it, but to restore its weight. It is to accept that dignity cannot be preserved by denial, and that legacy built on silence is already broken. The dynasty did not fall because its secret was revealed. It fell because it was built on the assumption that secrets could replace justice. Remembering now is an act of responsibility. It does not punish the dead, but it chaos for those who were never allowed to speak. It challenges the version of history that flatters power and ignores suffering. It insists that what was done matters, even if time has passed. In confronting this final keynote, we are reminded that history is not only what survives in records, but what survives in conscience. When stories like this are buried, society loses more than facts. It loses the ability to recognize the warning signs of repetition. Silence teaches nothing. Memory, however painful, teaches everything. The agreement destroyed a dynasty, but the forgetting that followed threatened something larger, the integrity of historical truth itself. By recovering this story, we do not reopen old wounds. We acknowledge that they were never allowed to heal. And in doing so, we reclaim a fragment of humanity that was denied for far too long.